Chapter 10. Friends. The common room was crowded and noisy. The Halloween feast had been set up on a buffet table in the middle of the room, and the couches and chairs were overflowing, with many people eating whilst sitting on the floor. Hermione noticed a number of people staring in her direction, probably at Harry and Ron, who were looking pretty disheveled themselves. But once her bushy head of hair ducked inside, covered in dust and tangled with little bits of rubble, everyone was staring. The clamor of the fight with the troll had probably been heard clear throughout the castle, and it was easy to see now who had been involved. Before she could speak a word, Hermione found herself mobbed by 3 hysterical witches. "Oh my God, Hermione, are you okay?" Hermione's mind went blank as Alicia caught her in a bone-crushing hug. Meanwhile, Lavender and Parvati both got in her face, talking non-stop so she could only catch every other word. "Everyone was so scared of the troll, we didn't even think, and then Professor Vector, and we were like, oh, Merlin. What happened? We thought it ate you. Did you get hurt, girls?" "Girls. I'm fine," Hermione stammered, pushing them away to give herself some space. That probably would have been more convincing if her hands weren't still shaking. No. She'd just been through a near-death experience. She wasn't fine and probably wouldn't be for a while, but she was unhurt. Anyway, by now, Sally Ann and Lillian, Alicia's friends, Angelina Johnson and Katie Bell, were crowding around to see what had happened to their fellow Gryffindor. Across the room, she could see Harry and Ron being interrogated by the boys as they loaded up her plates. She really just wanted to get to dinner, but she was surrounded now. "Hermione, we were so worried. What happened?" Lavender said. She started trying to comb the debris out of Hermione's hair with her fingers, which Hermione found oddly comforting. She collected herself and started talking. The troll came in the bathroom. Several of the girls squeaked in fright. It came after me and smashed up the sinks. None of my spells were strong enough to do anything. But then, Harry and Ron came and saved me." "Ron saved you?" Alicia said. Lavender and Parvati looked equally shocked. "Well, not very well," she admitted. "Then Professor Vector came in and saved all 3 of us." And she explained about Harry's and Ron's incompetent rescue attempt, her lucky break with the levitation charms, and how Professor Vector had run in and stopped the troll in 3 seconds flat, and how she had defended them to the other professors. "I can't believe you did that." Alicia said. "I can't believe Harry and Ron did that." Parvati said. "I can't believe you got 30 points. Katie Bell added. "I can't believe you didn't get detention," said Angelina Johnson. "I can't believe nobody got eaten." Lavender exclaimed. The other first years stared at her. "Eaten?" Hermione asked nervously. "Aha, I heard a mountain troll can take your leg off with 1 bite." The others all grimaced. Alicia quickly changed the subject. "Look, Hermione, about what Ron said. He's all wrong. You know, we're you friends, right? Me and Cedric and Roger." And so are we," Parvati said. The other first years nodded in agreement. "And us, too." She jumped as Fred and George Weasley were now standing over her shoulder. Those 2 still weren't her first choice, but she guessed that was nice of them. Yeah," she said, breaking into a smile. She was starting to feel misty-eyed again. It was good to know she really did have that many friends, but she still didn't feel like she'd been a very good one herself. "And don't be too hard on Ron," she said. They all gave her surprised looks. "Well, he already apologized, and, really, I just needed to work through some things on my own. Well, a lot of things, actually. And still did," she thought, but she could worry about that when she wasn't about to faint from hunger. "Excuse me, please, I haven't had anything to eat all day," she said timidly, hopefully deferring any further questions until later. The crowd parted for her, and she made her way to the buffet table. A great feast was laid out, like the welcome feast, making her mouth water. She quickly loaded up a plate with enough food to give Ron a run for his money, then looked around for a place to sit. She saw Harry and Ron sitting on the floor in one of the emptier parts of the circular room, near the fire. She thought about how upside down this day had been and decided it was well past time to reevaluate those 2. She walked over and, still a little uneasily, sat down next to them with her plate in her lap. "Hi," she said. "Aw, thanks for saving me." Harry smiled kindly. "Anytime," he said. "You helped, too," Ron observed. "What was that?" "Well, I saw when you cast that spell, I saw the Trolls Club kind of bounce, so I just figured, with 3 of us, we might be able to lift it." Wow. Well, I'm sure glad that worked. Hermione nodded and hesitantly took a few bites as she tried to put her thoughts into words. I still can't believe you came for me, she said. I mean, I've barely even spoken to you since school started. Well, somebody had to do it. We couldn't just leave you alone like that, Harry said. Besides, we did kinda lock it in there with you. What? We were gonna try and find you, but then we saw the troll go into the room and decided to trap it. We didn't realize you were in there until we heard you scream. Oh, yeah, we didn't even know what room it was, Ron said. Or at least she thought that's what he said, since he still insisted on talking with his mouth full. It figured these two would make things worse before they made them better. You really should pay more attention, she said in spite of herself. Ron rolled his eyes, but Harry didn't seem to mind. Yeah, I guess, he said. I was kinda more worried about not getting hit with that club, Ron protested. That thing was horrible. You're telling me, Hermione squeaked. Her knife slipped and scratched loudly on her plate as she tried to steady her hands. I was sure I was about to die before you came in. Yeah, and it's a good thing Professor Vector came looking for you, too. I still don't know what I was trying to do casting that spell. Mind. The crazy part is it actually worked. I couldn't think of any spells, Harry commented, remembering how his best idea was to climb up the troll's back. But that was amazing how Professor Vector froze it like that. I know, she exclaimed. I've read about things like that, but I've never seen anything like it. I've got to learn how to do that spell. Me too, Ron added. My brother, Bill, he had to be really good at arithmancy and stuff to become a cursebreaker, but I thought that kind of stuff was all in defense. Your brother's a cursebreaker? She said interestedly. Aha. He works for Gringotts in Egypt getting the curses off all the old tombs and stuff. Hermione was duly impressed. She'd heard Ron talk about his brothers before, but never paid it much mind. But Professor Vector said curse breaking was some of the most difficult magic there was. It would take someone really good to do it for a living. Hey, Hermione, that reminds me. Did I tell you about that package Hagrid got from Gringotts? Said Harry. She shook her head. I think I was trying not to listen. Oh, sorry. No, it's fine. Go ahead and tell me about it. Well, when Hagrid took me to Diagon Alley, we got some money from my vault in Gringotts, and then we went to this other vault that was really high security, but there was only one little thing in there. It was wrapped in brown paper, and it was about this big. Harry indicated something that was small enough to fit in his hand. And Hagrid took it out, and he said it was very secret Hogwarts business, and he wouldn't tell me what it was. But I read in the newspaper that someone tried to rob a vault that had just been emptied later that same day. So you think the dog is guarding whatever was in the vault? Yeah. Hagrid said Gringotts is the safest place to keep something except Hogwarts. You haven't gone back in there, have you? Hermione asked nervously. No. Of course not. I mean, if Hogwarts is really that safe, it's not like it's in any danger, right? I wonder what Snape was doing, though, Ron mused. Snape, said Hermione. We saw him headed towards the third floor when we came to find you, said Harry. Huh. That's odd. I don't know what someone would be doing there at a time like that. I wonder what's so valuable that they'd have to keep it here like that. Or so dangerous, Ron suggested. Or that. It's probably some kind of jewel or talisman or something if it's that small. Maybe we could research it and narrow it down. What, more homework? I'll pass, Ron protested. I don't get how you do it. You've already got an extra class. Arithmancy's not that hard. Hermione protested. Of course, she realized. She'd been telling her muggle friends that about maths for years and still hadn't convinced them. Maybe for you. How you get so good at arithmancy, anyway? Just practice. And a little luck, I guess. I've always been able to do maths well, as long as I can remember. Anyway, I think we should try to find it out. It could be important. Then why don't you do it? It doesn't really matter, does it? Whatever the thing is, it's safe, right? Well, I just thought. She stopped and sighed. Sorry. I know I can be a bossy know-it-all sometimes. You're not that bad, really, Harry said. Though you can go a little overboard. I was pretty mad when you kept interfering that day with the duel and stuff, but that was 'cause I really hate Malfoy. You were just trying to keep us out of trouble. And you were right about Malfoy's trick. Oh, yeah, Malfoy, Hermione grumbled. Now there's somebody I wouldn't mind seeing attacked by a troll, Ron said. and Hermione had a hard time disagreeing. Harry laughed a little. Yeah, he's been really awful all year, Harry said. To you, too, Hermione. I saw him sabotage your potion last week. Aha, she agreed. He's even worse than that, though. He actually hexed me in the back once. What? Harry yelled. When did he do that? Ron choked on his steak. Do you remember when I was making my map of the castle? Ron scrunched up his face, trying to remember. Oh, yeah, I think Fred and George said something about it. How'd that go, anyway? She shrugged her shoulders. Well, I think I got most of the school that students are allowed in. But the measurements keep changing, so it's not exact. You mean the castle changes shape? Harry said in surprise. Of course it does, mate. It's magic, Ron said, as if it were obvious. So what happened with Malfoy, then? Well, I was mapping out the dungeons when he saw me and accused me of spying on Slytherin. And then he used a jelly legs jinx on me. Oh, man, what did you do? Nothing, she said in embarrassment. A Hufflepuff prefect saved me. That little git. You want us to hex him for you? Ron asked. No. That'll just make it worse. He already jinxed me and got me in more trouble after potions last week. And he accused me of setting Fred and George on him on Tuesday. I just want him to leave me alone. I don't get what his problem is. It's his whole family, Ron said. Dad says Malfoy's family's been really anti-Muggle pretty much forever. His family should have just stayed in France. Then, Hermione complained. Maybe the French kicked them out, Ron joked. You know, they said, ne jamais faire confiance à un mec don't le nom signify more vacher foi. Hermione's eyebrows shot up. Tu parles français? Oui, he shrugged. Oh, sorry. I don't, Harry said. He said, never trust a bloke whose name means bad faith, Hermione explained. Harry smirked. When did you learn French? Mum made us all learn when we were little, Ron replied. He sounded annoyed about it. I guess Mum and Dad were thinking about moving to France during the war, and they still wanted all us kids to learn it, just in case. A little German, too, though I don't know why. The Weasleys would never be caught dead at Durmstrang. You speak 3 languages? Ron shook his head. Mostly just the 2, but I guess I know enough German and Spanish in case I got lost there or something. Oh, has estado en España? No, viajen mucho. Sorry, we don't travel much. Viajamos. Hermione corrected absently. Right. Mum and Dad go to visit Bill or Charlie once in a while, but they can't. We can't really. Ron started turning red as the conversation drifted a little too close to home. Hermione could tell he got a lot of his things second-hand. So how'd you learn so many languages? He asked her. My parents like to travel. She felt like she should leave it at that. I'm probably not that much better at Spanish than you are, though. I have enough trouble with just English, Harry said uneasily. Well, French isn't that hard, Ron said, surprising Hermione, who didn't expect him to describe anything that way. So, what were you making that map for, anyway? Asked Harry. Just to find my way around, and to show my parents what the castle is like. It's so confusing here with all the hidden doors and moving staircases. It seemed silly that they couldn't give us maps to at least show us where everything is. Yeah, that would be nice, Harry said. We almost got busted by Filch our first day because we got lost by the 3rd floor corridor, Ron added. Me too. They need to put up a sign or something. Anyway, after we met that dog, I memorized as much of the castle as I could so it wouldn't happen again. The whole castle. Everything on my map, she confirmed. There are some parts one still don't know anything about. Like the 3rd floor, Harry said. That's one of them. And some of the towers are always locked. And, have you ever looked at the Great Hall from outside? Harry and Ron looked at each other. Yeah, I guess, Harry replied. Have you seen the little windows on top? Both boys shook their heads. Well, they're there. I'm sure they're above the enchanted ceiling. But no one seems to know how to get up there or even what's up there. Even Fred and George didn't know. Ron looked suitably surprised. They didn't. I thought they knew everything. So did I, but they couldn't find out anything about them. I was gonna try and find a way up there myself, but I haven't got around to it yet. We could help you out, Harry suggested. Really? Hermione's eyes went a little wider. Sure, when we can, anyway. I've got a lot of Quidditch practice for the match next week. Oh, right, Alicia's been going on about it. Harry was obviously very excited about the first Quidditch match, as was most of Gryffindor, since it had been so long since they'd been able to field a competitive team. Hermione politely sat through Harry's and Ron's detailed description of exactly how Quidditch worked. She still thought the part with the snitch was more than a bit silly. It almost seemed as if it were designed to be deliberately frustrating, but she held her tongue out of respect for the boys' obvious enthusiasm. They talked for a long time about nothing in particular. They tried to talk about their families, what they could, anyway. Ron was from a wizarding family, so neither Harry nor Hermione understood the finer points of that. Only Harry knew what a dentist was or understood much else that Hermione had to say about her parents, and Harry didn't want to talk about his relatives, who, from what Hermione could gather, didn't sound very nice. Still they kept at it, moving on to books and films and plays, although they didn't have a lot they could share there either. Ron didn't seem to be much of a reader, even of wizarding books, and Harry had apparently led an extremely sheltered childhood. Objectively, she really didn't have much more in common with these two than she did with Parvati and Lavender, except that they did just face a mountain troll together. That definitely counted for something, so she didn't mind so much, now. Honestly, she felt like she didn't mind all that much about the girls at the moment, either. Maybe it was just a matter of perspective. The plates were taken away after a while, and a while after that, people started heading up to bed, but the three of them kept talking, oblivious. They went on for a while about classes and what a greasy git Snape was, and Hermione told them about Professor Vector and the basics, very basics, of Arithmancy. And there was another round of speculation about how the troll got into the castle and just what was hidden on the third floor and whether it could possibly be related, which they dismissed as ridiculous, and a lot of other, less important things that none of the three would remember anything about in the morning, and as they sat and talked, the pieces of Hermione's life slowly seemed to fall back into place, and she felt the tension slowly drain out of her limbs for the first time in weeks. She was utterly exhausted, but that wasn't what did it. Indeed, it was when the darkness closed in late at night, and she couldn't fight back sleep anymore whether she wanted to or not, that she agonized most over everything. But tonight, even though she was dead tired, she kept talking because tomorrow, she would worry about getting enough sleep, and fixing everything else, too. And she would need to worry about it, she knew, but for tonight, she was just going to not worry about any of it and just celebrate still being alive. And, she found, she was actually having fun with it. Parvati and Lavender had said goodnight and gone up to bed an hour ago. They clearly wanted to talk some more, but they gave her space for the time being. The common room was nearly empty by now, and a tired-looking Alicia came up and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Hermione, I'm going to bed. Are you doing okay?" she asked. Hermione's brain derailed for a moment. "Yes," she said instinctively. "No, I don't know, I'm sorry, I just need some time. It's been a hard week." "Okay, well, we can talk tomorrow if you want," Alicia assured her. "And don't stay up too late. You don't want to miss any more class. That goes the same for you, too," she told Harry. "We don't need you getting in any trouble before the match." "Oh, bloody hell. That's right, we have potions tomorrow," exclaimed Ron. Harry looked genuinely frightened at the thought. Professor Snape did seem to be harder on Harry than everyone else. "We'd better get to bed," Harry agreed. He stood up slowly and leaned against a sofa. "What do you think we'll be brewing?" "Probably a dizziness draft, based on how Professor Snape's been following the book," Hermione suggested, standing up herself and leaning on a chair. "Or, man, I didn't even look at that one," Ron whined. "Me either," Harry said nervously. "I have," Hermione said. "Hey, do you want to, switch partners in class tomorrow? I don't think Dean will mind. And we're both getting pretty good, really?" Ron said hopefully. "Are you sure?" Harry added. "I mean, you said you've been having a hard week." "It's nothing, really. It's not that hard to follow the instructions." "Wow, sure, thanks. Yeah, that's real nice of you." After Ron started. "I'm sorry, again. Well, you did save me. Yeah, but it was my fault in the first place." She sat down and curled up defensively in the chair, and she shook her head dismissively. "It wasn't just that. Actually, it mostly wasn't that at all. I've just been having a really awful week. There was Snape, and Malfoy, and the pranks, and my study group was, well, that's not important. And I've been sleeping very poorly. I've been losing track of time, losing focus. But you're still getting the best marks in our year, Ron protested. I know, but it's got harder and harder for me to keep up. I think I just need to back off the late night reading and get more sleep, but the stress has really been getting to me. It makes everything that much harder. And that's not all. There's so many things I can't tell my parents or the teachers, or even other students, some of it. Like about the third floor. You two and Neville are the only ones who know about it. It's hard not having anyone I can talk to. She kept looking at Ron and fought to keep her hands from shaking. That's the thing. Ron, I really snapped at you in class because I was already under so much stress from everything else. And then when you said that about me, I'm sorry, Ron blurted out. I know, it's just, when you said that, it hurt so much because you were right. She clutched at the arms of the chair, fighting back tears. She couldn't believe she was saying this out loud, much less to these two, but it felt so good to get this weight off her shoulders. I've been spending all my time alone, and I just couldn't take it anymore. And I think my real problem was I was being a lot harder on myself than you were. Anyway, I'm sure Alicia and the others will set me straight if I actually let them. It's good to know I do have friends to help out here. I'll say you do, Ron half complained. They've been setting me straight all day. Mind, I was being pretty stupid, he admitted, sitting back down again. I knew the twins liked you and stuff. I guess I was just really mad, 'cause I couldn't do that spell. It's hard, you know? Having 5 older brothers. Bill was head boy, and Charlie was Quidditch captain. And Percy's a prefect, and even Fred and George get really good marks when they try. Everyone expects me to be like them, including the teachers, but even if I do get good marks, it's no big deal because they did it first. So when you beat me at doing that spell in class. He trailed off, turning an unnaturally bright red in the firelight. You were jealous? Harry suggested. Yeah, I guess. I was mad, anyway. Mum's always yelling at me about it and saying how I need to apply myself more if I want to do as well as them. She's gonna go spare when she hears about this. Hermione thought Ron's mother had a point, but she kept that to herself. Still, that was unusually deep for the red-headed boy, undoubtedly brought on by being told just how big a git he was all day, by the sounds of it. Well, my cousin's a lot worse, Harry said uneasily as he tried to cheer Ron up. He always said I was cheating if I got a better grade than him, and my aunt and uncle would take his side. I got really good at getting by with a D+. Ron smirked a little, evidently have heard about Harry's family. Harry, no offense, but your relatives really do sound awful, said Hermione. Yeah, but it's all right. They can't bother me here, and they don't like magic, so they don't care what grades I get. Hermione thought that sounded like one of the most dysfunctional families she'd ever heard of, but Harry didn't seem too keen to say any more. When she tried, he turned it into a joke and changed the subject. Still, he didn't look that troubled about it. Maybe being away from them really was enough for him. Ron could open up a little more, but with Harry's unique situation and Hermione being an only child, they didn't have much to reply to him. But then Ron asked about the dizziness draft, and one thing led to another, and, somehow, they managed to stay up and talk for another hour. On any other night, Hermione would have been having a fit over losing track of the time yet again, but tonight, she was okay with it. It was her choice, for once, and that, it seemed, made all the difference. She was a little surprised that she'd told the boys so much. But at the same time, she was a little surprised they'd been so open with her. Maybe it was the late hour messing with all 3 of them, she thought. Still, it felt nice being able to talk to someone for a change and not having to keep secrets. Actually, she felt very strange, giddy and tired and turned on her head all at the same time. Even though not much had objectively changed, something made her look at things differently, like all those friends who had crowded around her when she came into the common room. Now that she could finally look at things in a better way, she felt much lighter. And yes, she did need get more sleep, and she needed to talk to people and socialize more, too, but, surprisingly, even that fact was a comfort now that she understood it properly. Now that she knew what was really the matter, she was sure she could fix it. And then there were Harry and Ron, the boys who were Gryffindor enough to save her from a mountain troll when she was barely speaking to them. She still had to wonder about the Sorting Hat's judgment when her main contribution had been to be Ravenclaw enough to come up with a half-decent plan to get them out of it. In any case, if she thought about it, she could relate to them no worse than her roommates, and they got in less trouble than the twins. She had to conclude they really weren't that bad at all. The common room clock chimed 12, and Harry and Ron finally stood back up, again looking a little worried about finishing so late on a potions night. I guess we really had better get to bed, Harry said. Yeah, mate, Ron agreed. Snape's bad enough when I've got enough sleep. Yeah, we should, Hermione said. There was an awkward pause. So, friends? Harry said, looking at both of them, but mostly at her. She froze. Harry smiled disarmingly. She looked to Ron, who had been more put off by her know-it-all-ness. The boy nodded slightly at Harry, then looked at her. Hermione smiled. Yes, she agreed. Friends. Chapter 11. Rest and Relaxation. Does someone want to explain how a mountain troll got into the castle? Septima Vector demanded as soon as she came into the emergency staff meeting the next morning, and she wasn't the only one. Minerva had even more right to be angry than Septima, since it was 3 of her students who had been endangered. And Hermione Granger was the favorite of many of the teachers, with the exception of Severus. No one bothered asking why the defense professor had fainted at the sight of a troll. That was almost to be expected these days. I think we would all like to know that, Septima, Minerva said acidly, glaring at Quirrell. Once again, if any sort of disaster happened, it was the defense professor who was usually the first suspect. But now, the headmaster approached the table. I inspected the wards myself last night, he said grimly. The troll entered the castle from the ravine through the drainage tunnels in the sub-basement. From there, it began climbing, eventually reaching the first-floor washrooms. But why didn't the wards alert us when it entered the grounds, much less the castle? Minerva protested. The wards had been specifically opened to permit trolls to pass through without report, the headmaster said, to the surprise of most of the table. Quirinus, do you have anything to say about that? Quirrell turned even paler than usual and started stammering fearfully. I opened the WW wards to bring in a TT troll. His voice squeaked loudly, for the PP protections on the stone. IMMM must N not have C close them P properly, he whimpered. About half the staff groaned and raised their hands to their foreheads. Severus glared at Quirrell suspiciously. The defense professor had taught Muggle studies for years, but taking a year off and switching positions was a quick way to get turned into an outsider. After all, with the apparent curse on the position, they already knew he probably wouldn't be around next year. Septima felt a bit sorry for him at times, but not anymore. Actually, she had to wonder how a troll would be that big of an obstacle in the first place. But if it were charmed magic resistant, it might be. Your mistake nearly got 3 of my first-year students killed, Quirinus, Minerva hissed, slipping deeper into her Scottish brogue. Frankly, you're lucky we don't have anyone to replace you at the moment, or you'd be out of here by the end of the day. As it is, that is not possible, Albus said gently. I resealed the anti-troll wards last night and checked all the other wards for good measure. The castle is once again secure. Secure against anything but more incompetence, Bathsheba babbling commented. There is another issue to be addressed, Septima said harshly. I move that we review our emergency procedures. In the chaos last night, only I and 2 of Miss Granger's classmates remembered that she was not at the feast. It is unacceptable that we would lose track of a student like that. Miss Granger's extraordinary arithmancy skills might well have saved her life, since it seems no one else remembered to look for her. Minerva turned noticeably pink at that. The prefects should be required to do a head count in such a situation and report anyone who is missing. Phileas and Pomona instantly agreed to that, and the motion carried quickly, with the 3 of them drafted to make the review. Very good, Albus concluded. Now, Severus, I believe you had an additional security concern. Yes, the potions master said. Letting the troll into the castle would have been the perfect distraction for someone to try to steal the stone. Perhaps a mission of opportunity, or perhaps not. He glared at Quirrell again. Why yes, I had the same C concern and WW went up there as well, Quirrell said nervously. I approached the 3rd floor immediately after the warning and again once the troll was dealt with, Severus continued. I could find no sign of a breach, but Hagrid's dog made it impossible to search thoroughly. Hey, now, Fluffy was you doing his job, Hagrid protested. How is your leg, Severus? Minerva asked. I will be fine, Severus growled. He glared back and forth between Quirrell and Hagrid. Let us just hope that we have no more similar incidents in the future. Are you sure it's even the best idea to keep that thing here in the first place? Septima asked. The headmaster nodded firmly. As I have said, it is vital that we keep the stone secure. You know that I would not allow it to be kept within the walls of Hogwarts if the students could not be kept safe, and if it would not be even more dangerous to the wizarding world to keep it elsewhere. Unless I can convince Nicholas and Perenelle to dispose of it, it must stay here. A majority of the staff grumbled at that, but they knew the stakes just as well as he did. And the protections were sound. Everyone involved agreed that no one person besides Dumbledore himself could get through them. Certainly, Septima was sure no one could get through her part. They would conclude that they had to accept the arrangement, just as they had when he had first proposed it. Now, then, to the repair work. Argus, what is your assessment of the damage? Albus asked. Argus Filch looked even more disgruntled than usual today. He wasn't exactly the type for dealing with catastrophes like this, and not only because he was a squib, but as caretaker. It was technically his job to organize repairs to the castle when it was damaged. There's about nothing left in there, he wheezed angrily. It'll take you lot all weekend just to clear out the debris. I don't have the tools for that. We'll have to knock out parts of the walls and rebuild them if we want to do it right, reinstall all the fixtures from scratch. Why'd you have to go and make such a mess of things, Quirrell? My apologies. Thank you, Argus, Albus replied. I myself will oversee the repairs. The ancient magic within the walls of Hogwarts is a rather tricky medium to work in. Once the walls are repaired, it should be simple to install new plumbing fixtures. We should be able to reopen the bathroom in a very few weeks. Hermione was correct that they were to brew the dizziness draft in potions class. Dean had no objection to working with Harry, so she helped Ron muddle through. It was a little trying on her patience, especially as Ron had not got into the habit of keeping his workspace clean, but she did it, and they produced a draft that she thought would be worth an E grade. Surprisingly, Professor Snape didn't say anything about their new partner arrangement. In fact, the class was unusually pleasant today. Not because of Snape's temperament, indeed, he was a good deal more acerbic than normal, but because he never once rose from his desk, and that meant he couldn't wander the room making his usual caustic comments to the Gryffindors and gratuitous compliments to Draco Malfoy. Seems kind of suspicious, don't you think? Harry said at lunch. What do you mean? Hermione was sitting with Harry and Ron for the second meal that day, something her other friends had noticed well after how Ron had treated her yesterday. But aside from being interrogated by Parvati and Lavender at breakfast, among the many people who wanted to hear what it was like facing a troll, she mostly let the boys answer that. None of them had said anything about it. Why Snape didn't leave his desk. Harry said. He missed plenty of chances to insult us. Maybe he felt like being nicer for a change. Yeah, right. Ron guffawed. Or maybe he's tired from cleaning up after last night. I doubt he meant anything by it. Harry looked skeptical, but he didn't say anything more. Why, hello, Hermione, a voice sounded in stereo behind her. She looked up and braced herself for whatever the Weasley twins had cooked up today. But they were looking friendly at the moment. And wait, she was Hermione to them, now? She supposed that was nice of them. We hope you're feeling better today. She was pretty sure it was George who said it. Fred, on her other side, was idly picking over the food on the table. Much better, thank you. All made up with your little friends, now? Fred said in a babyish tone. Cool it, Fred, said Ron. That was pretty brave of you running in there like that, Ron, George said. Mum'd be proud, except she's gonna kill you first. Ron's ears turned red enough to match his hair. Well, I'm doing all right, now, Hermione assured them. I was really just being too hard on myself. I think you were kind of right. I did need to lighten up a bit. Oh, we're so glad to hear that, George said with a mischievous grin. Because hanging around with Percy was bad enough. Hanging around with two of our brothers. That's double trouble. She rolled her eyes. I think I'll take my chances. Brave words, Hermione. We'll see if you can live up to them. The twins walked away, chuckling. Are they always like that? She asked. Yeah, Ron said, but don't worry. They'd never hurt their friends, just annoy them. Ron lifted the cover on one of the dishes in front of him. The moment he did, a swarm of large gypsy moths flew out and started fluttering densely around all three of their heads. Hermione screwed up her face and did her best to swat them away. Fred! Ron roared, jumping out of his seat. Down the table, Fred and George high-fived. So, yeah, I know Ron was being a git, but he figured that out on his own pretty quickly. And I only really let it get to me because he'd hit so close to the truth. After lunch and classes were over for the day, The other Gryffindor girls had all but picked Hermione up and carried her back to the common room, insisting on getting the full story out of her without any more delay. Now that she had accepted it for herself, or had started to, Hermione managed to get through the story with only a few tears. In fact, between them, the girls around her were showing more tears than she was. And they were all very impressed, more than she thought she deserved, at how she had devised a plan to knock out the troll on the spot. There were sure to be all sorts of crazy rumors about it by Monday. Lavender and Parvati sat on either side of her, each wrapping an arm around her as she related the trials of the past few weeks. It was an eye-opening experience for a lot of the girls that she had been suffering so much so silently, and several of them started commiserating about their own hidden problems by the end of it. "Oh Morgana, Hermione, how could you go through so much like that without flunking out or something?" Lavender said. "I never could have made it going through what you have. That's just how I was raised," Hermione said softly. "My parents made sure that no matter what happened, I would never let it interfere with my schoolwork, and they helped me a lot along the way when I needed it. I just kept doing what I've always done." "It just sounds so awful," Parvati said. "Is there anything we can do for you?" Hermione smiled slightly. "Well, honestly, I think if you could just remind me of when to go to bed, it would be a big help." "Of course," Parvati and Lavender said at once. Hermione wasn't sure she liked how eagerly they accepted the job. "Thanks, girls," she said, once again feeling much better than she expected. True to their word, her roommates made sure she got up to bed at a reasonable hour that night, and, thankfully, they weren't too pushy about it. She laid down to sleep feeling every bit as good as she had the night before, and to her surprise and great relief, she managed to stay asleep until it was time to head down to breakfast. Her resultant good mood was enough to carry her through the whole day. Hermione had already come up with a response to Fred and George by dinner-time last night, but it took her until morning to work up the nerve to use it. As everyone was getting ready to go to breakfast, she spotted them in the common room. Surprisingly, they weren't dressed alike today. Dressed in casual clothes for the weekend, one of them was wearing a red shirt, and the other was wearing a blue one. "Hi there, Fred and George," she said with a smile. "Good morning," they replied amiably. "Listen, you asked me to tell you if I learned anything new about the castle." "That we did," George replied. "How touching that you remembered," added Fred. "Did you find out what's above the Great Hall?" "No, not yet, but there was something else that I should have told you a while ago." The twins were all ears. "Have you two ever been to the They learned at each other?" "Why? No," George said. "Did you see something interesting up there?" "I saw a lot of interesting things when I explored the Great Tower a few weeks ago," she said precisely. "Such as?" Fred asked. "Well, it's hard to explain. You really have to see it to believe it." They grinned at each other. "Very interesting. We'll have to check that out after breakfast. Thanks for the tip," George said. "Sure, no problem," she replied innocently. Hermione indulged herself in a mischievous smile after the pair left the common room. That had been too easy and entirely too much fun. With her plan set in motion, she went down to the Great Hall for breakfast with a spring in her step, then came back up to the common room and curled up on one of the sofas with her calculus book. She laughed out loud when she remembered that the next lesson was about limits at infinity. She was still getting funny looks from people when she did this. Most people, Muggle and magical alike, balked at seeing those kinds of equations, but for Hermione Granger, this was her idea of a relaxing morning. She was at it for a little while when she heard someone call her name. Harry and Ron had come down to the common room, bringing some of their course books, which surprised her for a Saturday morning. "What are you working on?" Harry asked. "Calculus." "What's that?" Ron said. "My maths independent study. Arithmancy's nice, but the maths is way too easy." Ron looked over her shoulder at the unfamiliar symbols on the page with a disbelieving look, but he held his tongue. It had taken him only a few minutes to learn not to question Hermione about her attitude towards maths. "So you really can do crazy maths stuff in your head?" he finally said as he sat down. "Well, I wouldn't call it crazy, right, but, like, you can figure out what's 195 times 748. 145,860, she said casually. "Bloody hell. I thought Fred and George were joking when they said you could do that," Ron said while Harry's eyebrows disappeared under his messy fringe. Hermione shot Ron a dirty look for his language, but she answered, "No, it's not that hard if you want to learn it, but this stuff is completely different." She indicated her book. "What is it, then?" Ron asked. Well, this in particular is limits at infinity. It's like. She tried to think of how to explain limits to someone who didn't even know algebra yet. Say you have a bunch of numbers, and they're 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, and so on. What number would you get if they kept going on forever? Ron looked perplexed, but Harry tentatively said, I guess 0, right? It's like that, but a lot fancier. Ron and Harry looked at each other and shrugged their shoulders. What are you working on, then? She asked them. Harry sighed. Transfiguration. I don't know how I'm gonna get all this stuff done with all the extra Quidditch practices Wood's scheduled. Do you? Do you think you could give us a hand? Hermione closed her book. Sure. As long as you don't expect me to do it for you. Let me see. With her help, both boys got through quite a bit of their transfiguration homework that morning. They barely noticed her frequent glances toward the common room door. But her vigilance paid off when, nearly at lunchtime, 2 disheveled and disturbed redheads ran into the common room. Both of them were wearing shirts that were half red and half blue, divided along a randomly zigzagging edge. Hermione Granger. They yelled as stumbled over and knelt on either side of her chair. Whoa, what happened to you? Ron said. We were in the grand staircase and way above the top, and there were. Both of them were out of breath and incoherent. And Harry and Ron were baffled. But Hermione just smiled smugly and said, So, how high did you get? To her friend's amazement. Big, huge moths. Fred held his hands a couple of feet apart, crawling everywhere. George added, We got swarmed. We tried to repel them with our wands. The magic didn't like that. Our shirts. Wow. That sounds like it's about as high as I got. It's a good thing I didn't try to cast any spells. Wait, you did this to them? Ron exclaimed. I only suggested that they try to explore the grand staircase, Hermione said, still smiling. You told us to climb to the top, Fred complained. No, I believe I only asked if you'd been. Fred and George stared at each other again, wondering how they'd been had so easily, while Harry and Ron were staring at Hermione in utter confusion. I'm pretty sure the grand staircase just goes on forever, she explained. But it all has to fit in the tower, so it keeps getting smaller, and the bugs and mice and stuff look huge when you get high enough. And there's so much magic that it mixes everything up, like their shirts, and you knew all along. Did you put those moths up there, too? George demanded. No, of course not. I'm not going back up there. That was just luck. I told you, brother, Fred said. Merlin help us if Hermione starts using those brains of hers for pranking. Now, we're all in trouble. Hermione giggled slightly. Indeed, George replied. You are a worthy opponent, Miss Granger, they said in unison, tipping imaginary hats. They stood and backed up the boys' staircase, as if not wanting to take their eyes off her. Wicked, you actually managed to prank Fred and George. Ron said. Oh, I've got to write Ginny about this. I didn't think you'd be one to break the rules, though, well, plenty of other people do, she groused. Besides, I don't think that was technically against the rules. Just not advised. Well, it's nice to see you have a Gryffindor side after all. You know they're going to try and get you back. Though, right? Yes, she sighed. But at least they know I'm not an easy target, now. That should keep me a little safer. They started to pack up the things for lunch. Oh, by the way, Harry, I still have Quidditch Through the Ages on loan from the library. Do you want to read it? Yeah, that'd be great, thanks. Hermione wanted to try exploring the Great Hall again, but with Harry's Quidditch practice and reading the book plus Ron being behind on homework, they didn't have all that much time. They went around the Great Hall once after lunch trying everything that looked like it might be a door, but plenty of doors in the castle were too well hidden for that. Afterwards, they told her she could keep going without them, but she didn't feel like it. She needed to finish her own homework, and address something that had been a growing concern in the back of her mind for the past 2 days. What was she going to tell her parents? Dear Mum and Dad, I want to start off by telling you that I'm fine, and even though some really bad things have been happening, they're over now, and I got through them all right. I hardly even know where to start, but I suppose I should get the worst out of the way first. On Halloween, a mountain troll got into the castle and attacked me, and then they would be too hysterical to read the rest. Hermione crumpled up the parchment, threw it in the bin, and started again. Dear Mum and Dad, I'm sorry I've been so distant lately. The truth is that I got myself into a bad habit of not getting enough sleep, which I'm just starting to get out of. Honestly, things are quite a bit better here than I think I've let on. And that was a blatant lie. There was no reasonable way she could objectively say that except that she just felt that way. Try again. Dear Mum and Dad, I think things are finally looking up here at Hogwarts. This was ridiculous. Was she really going to keep it from them? Why should she? But why shouldn't she? They'd have her out of Hogwarts before she could say, Wingardium Leviosa, if they knew the truth. But she just couldn't take the secrecy anymore. They deserved to know, didn't they? She would just tell them she was old enough to make her own decisions. Even if they involved extremely dangerous creatures, it was hopeless, wasn't it? Dear Mum and Dad. Hermione threw her quill down in disgust and slumped back in her seat. On a whim, she pulled out her wand and decided to try out a new charm she'd read about in the library, Lacanum Inflammari. A little blue flame shot out from the tip of her wand and landed on the parchment. It spread, and the parchment began to smolder. It felt rather satisfying to see the attempted letter go up in flames. From what she had read, the bluebell flame charm was supposed to consume very flammable things like parchment and cloth, but it didn't actually need fuel, and it was supposed to be cool enough to handle if one was careful. She reached out tentatively and brought her hand up to the flames. The fire felt like hot water as it licked her fingers, maybe uncomfortably hot, but not scalding. She laughed and scooped the flames into a spare jar from her potions kit before they started to scorch her wooden nightstand. The flames in the jar would make a nice little portable lamp and heater. Anyway, there was no way she was going to figure this out on her own. Maybe her new friends, or her old ones, could help. Tell your parents. Are you mental? Ron Weasley yelled. They won't understand. My mum completely freaked out when Percy told her, and she's a witch. They'll withdraw you, and the ministry'll snap your wand and erase your memory. Harry looked positively horrified at the suggestion. Ron, they don't do that to people who withdraw, Hermione corrected. They'd only make me transfer to another school, like Beauxbatons. Harry sighed with relief. But you can't want to leave Hogwarts, can you? Ron said. Of course not. But I can't keep keeping secrets from my parents. I need to be able to talk to them honestly. Well, I don't know. You can try if you want, but I'm telling you, no good'll come of it. Hermione sighed. That's what I'm afraid of. Harry, are you going to tell your relatives? No. They'd probably just be mad that I didn't die on them. Harry, it's fine, really. I'm sorry, I really wouldn't know what to do either. Well, thanks anyway. I think I need to think about it some more. The other students all had similar responses. Either rejecting the idea of telling her parents about the troll out of hand, or not really being able to come to an opinion. Her fellow Muggle-born, Sally Ann, was among the latter group and was one of several who suggested that she ask a teacher for advice. More than one person had suggested that she go to Professor McGonagall, but Hermione was reluctant to do so. She still didn't consider her head of house to be the most supportive teacher, though her housemates had few problems with her. And more to the point, she was a little worried about the consequences of any stories other than the glossed-over version she told reaching the ears of the deputy headmistress. It took her longer than it ought to have, well into Sunday afternoon, before she remembered that there was one adult in the castle who did know the full story, or more of it than the others, anyway. Of course, it was Sunday, and no one held office hours on Sunday. If she deluded herself into thinking she'd get the letter done today at all. So Hermione screwed up her Gryffindor courage and took a different tack. Few students besides the Weasley twins ever thought about where the teachers slept at night. Professor Trelawney, of course, stayed cooped up in her tower, and Professor Dumbledore's apartment was known to be above his office. Married staff often commuted, at least on the weekends, but most of the teachers weren't married. They were never really seen going in and out of their residences, as they usually stayed out until curfew themselves. It was only by paying careful attention while she was mapping the school that she figured out that the staff apartments were located in the Great Tower and the body of the West Wing. Her main clue had been the cluster of unusually notable portraits in that area. Her attention was first drawn there by a portrait that she was amazed that she could recognize as John Flamsteed, the first Astronomer Royal, who had been appointed before the Statute of Secrecy was enacted. The rest she could only identify as notable thanks to her overzealous reading habits. The Irish druidess Cleodna, a known animagus and one of the greatest transfiguration mistresses of the medieval period, appeared on one stretch of the corridor. Charms Mistress Hedwig of Vienna graced the corridor nearby. On the floor below was the preeminent Renaissance potioneer, Zygmunt Budge. But what had really tipped her off was when she studied John Flamsteed's portrait for so long that he asked her what she wanted and informed her for no apparent reason that Professor Sinistra was in her office. From that, it all became clear soon enough. Each portrait was a leading historical figure in his or her field, and each guarded the door to a professor's apartment, just like the fat lady guarded Gryffindor Tower. Once she looked up all the portraits, it was easy to piece together who lived where. She had decided not to tell Fred and George that little tidbit, although it wouldn't surprise her if they already knew it. And so it was that Hermione followed her map to the portrait of Bridget Wenlock, the founder of modern Arithmancy. Bridget Wenlock wore purple and had wild black hair and half-moon glasses. She didn't particularly look like she came from the 13th century. Unfortunately, she rather sounded like it. Even more unfortunately, Bridget Wenlock was known for both paranoia and absent-mindedness. "Excuse me, Madam Wenlock," Hermione said tentatively. "Forsooth. Taft purpoase hast thou, shield," the portrait said. Or at least that's what Hermione thought she said. I was just wondering if Professor Vector was in," she replied, doing her best to interpret the Middle English. "And ho Marthop Bay. Professor Vector. The Arithmancy professor? Arithmancy," the portrait shouted. "Ecam the Arithmancy Professor Hera. Has this Vector stolen me theores?" "What? No. Eek will not have hit. Madam Wenlock, you're a painting," Hermione pleaded. "You haven't been the Arithmancy professor for 700 years. I was hoping I could speak with Professor Vector. This is her apartment, isn't it?" I could come to her office tomorrow if she's not in. Stoadance are not to be given access," Wenlock started, but then the portrait frame swung open, and Professor Vector was standing in the doorway, smiling. "Miss Granger, what a pleasant surprise," she said. "Hello, Professor," Hermione said nervously. "I was wondering if I could talk to you." Of course. Please come in." Vector led her into a small parlor with a tea table and a couple of chairs and a desk in the corner. The room was furnished in the same general style as the Gryffindor common room, but with green accents. A kitchenette was visible through one door and a short hallway extended from one side of the room. Hermione decided it was a fairly nice apartment for one. "Have a seat," Vector said, indicating the chairs. "And don't worry about Bridget. She gave me that for a year after I started teaching here. I take it you figured out the clues from the portraits?" "Yes, Mom. I'm not surprised, with someone like you. Would you like some tea?" Sure, thank you, Mom." The professor produced 2 cups of tea and sat down across the table from Hermione. The first year sipped thoughtfully. "I was hoping you would come to see me, Miss Granger," Vector said. She was being about the friendliest Hermione had ever seen her. "I could tell you've been under a lot of stress lately, even before Thursday. All of your teachers say that your coursework remains exemplary, even Professor Snape, when one corrects for his usual bias, but there is more to life. I wouldn't want to see you burned out so early. If there is any way that I can help, you need only ask." Thank you, Professor. It's complicated. You see, I'm afraid I've let myself get into some very bad habits." She gave a brief summary of the disaster that the past few weeks had been as Vector listened with concern. "I am doing better now," she assured her. "I probably need some time to really get back on my feet, but I'm feeling a lot better getting a full night's sleep, and I'm working faster, too." Vector smiled a little. "But what I really wanted to talk to you about is, well, I usually write my parents every Sunday night." "Oh," Vector said with an understanding nod. "I just don't know what to tell them." The words came spilling out. "I've been keeping so many things from them. I don't like keeping secrets, and they deserve to know what's happening. I'm tired of not being able to talk to them. But I'm so afraid that if I tell them what happened, they pull me out and transfer me to Beauxbatons or something, and I don't want to leave Hogwarts, even with the bad stuff that's been going on. I really like it here, and I like my friends, and all my classmates say I shouldn't tell them, and they'd be so scared with me being away from them. And, Miss Granger." Vector cut her off. "Hermione." She gave her a sad smile and lightly patted her hands. "I know this can't be an easy decision for you, but ultimately it is one that you'll have to make for yourself. You're the one who knows your parents best. I just don't know what to do." Hermione whined with tears staining her cheeks. "Well, I'm glad you feel comfortable coming to me for advice, but I'm afraid I don't have much experience with this kind of situation. We only get about one Muggle born in Slytherin every 5 years or so, and about half of them wind up transferring at some point. I think you've already seen the unfortunate prejudice shared by most of my former house. And I've certainly never seen anyone attacked by a troll before. I promise you anything like that is quite a rare occurrence at Hogwarts. But I have seen difficult situations along similar lines, so I'll tell you what I have seen, and you can hopefully decide for yourself. Muggle-born students almost invariably wind up living in the magical world, Vector explained. After all, even after the short time you've been here, can you ever imagine going back to the life you had before? Their friends are all magical, and they usually marry magicals, because of the statute of secrecy, and unless they work very hard, like you are, they rarely have the educational credentials to get a good job in the Muggle world. Meanwhile, your parents are still living in the Muggle world. They have limited access to the magical one, and you're not allowed to do any magic at home. Now, it can be hard enough to relate to one another across that gap under normal circumstances, but I'm sure you know by now that about 10 years ago, there was a very bloody civil war in the magical world while things were perfectly fine in the Muggle one. It was very dangerous for everyone back then, but especially for Muggle-borns. Your friend Harry Potter's mother was a Muggle-born, and one of my best students, too. Dirk Cresswell, the year after her, he was another one. They came from homes where you'd hear about the occasional murder or assault somewhere, but it was a 1 in a million chance. But at school, every month they'd hear about more and more attacks on Muggle-borns. They started getting in fights with rising Death Eaters in Slytherin. I suspected some of them were marked Death Eaters. When they graduated, Lily Potter, at least, actively fought against them. Growing up in that world, they had an even more serious decision to make than you have, and to my knowledge, neither of them ever told their families. Never told them how much danger they were in. Whether they didn't want their parents to worry, or they didn't want to create a rift in their families over it, or they wanted to stand and fight for justice, or some combination of the three, I don't know. Whatever their reasons, they kept it up. They never told them. But it hurt them deeply. They hid it, of course, but you learn to recognize it as a teacher. You could see in their eyes how much it tore them up inside. Living through that does things to a person, and as far as I know, they both became completely estranged from their families, stopped contacting them altogether. Now, I'm not saying that will happen to you. Your situation is different, and your parents are different. I just thought you should know how I've seen things go before. Hermione was doing her level best not to start sobbing over the table. She would have been mortified to be seen like this around a teacher in public, but here in her parlor, it wasn't so bad. She was so grateful for Professor Vector being so frank with her. No matter how painful her words. Professor, she squeaked. I have to tell them. I can't let that happen. I can't. I understand, Hermione. If you like, you can tell me when you send your letter, and I can send one of my own to help explain the situation. If you are concerned about their reaction, a professional view might help. That's very generous of you, Mom. Thank you. My pleasure. I'm glad I could help. Hermione finished her tea and slowly composed herself, but her mind was already racing thinking about what needed to go into her letter. It was fast looking like it would wind up being longer than most of her homework essays. She was certain she wouldn't be able to send it tonight, and she could only hope her parents wouldn't be too worried about that. Finally, she felt ready to get up to leave. Thank you again, Professor, she said. No trouble at all. Hermione. Please come see me anytime if you need help. Hermione nodded and stood up, but then she remembered something. Professor? Yes. There was one other thing I was wondering about. How did you stop that troll so easily? Professor Vector smiled. That? It was actually quite simple. The freezing charm is a simple second-year defense charm. I just put a lot of power into it. Although even then, if you hadn't knocked it out, it only would have held long enough to get you out. Really? That's all it was? Yes. A crude method, I admit, but trolls aren't very bright, so it's all you need. There is a time, even in combat, to be really clever. This is especially true if you have less power than your opponent, as you yourself learnt. But there is also a time when something fast and simple is best. The power you need to cast a freezing charm that's strong will come with age and practice. Hermione wondered at how such a simple spell could have such amazing results, but she was glad to hear it wouldn't be too hard to learn down the road. She left the apartment and started back toward Gryffindor Tower. Professor Vector sighed as she left. That girl really was one of a kind. more than even she herself knew. Hermione wanted to get started on her letter right away, but she knew there was one more thing she needed to do first, uncomfortable though it was. She found her new friend in the common room and sat next to him. "Harry, can I ask you something?" Hermione said nervously. "Sure. It's okay if you don't want to answer." Now Harry looked a little confused. "What is it?" "Harry, did your aunt know what was going on with your parents? The war and everything?" Harry stopped and thought. It was something that hadn't really occurred to him. Aunt Petunia had said his parents had got blown up, but from what he'd heard, that wasn't exactly true. He had to wonder how much she really knew, the way she talked about her sister. It might even be something worth the risk to ask her next summer. "I don't think so," he said. "I know she didn't know about my dad's money, or she would have taken it. And she never talked about any of it except when Hagrid came. She knew my parents had been killed, but I don't think she ever really knew there was a war on." She nodded thoughtfully. "Professor Vector, you could talk to her if you wanted. She said your mum was one of her students. But she didn't think she ever told her parents about the war, and eventually she just stopped talking to them." "Well," Harry said slowly, "my aunt thought she was a freak from the beginning, so she did." "Why would she do that to her own sister?" "I don't know. I guess some people are just like that. Kinda like Malfoy." Harry didn't have any more to say after that. Hermione pondered his words as she climbed up to her dorm room. She started writing. But it was going to take a while.